Well, there's an awful lot going on in the British economy at the moment. Some of this is, frankly, deep-seated problems that have been around for a long time. Some are comparatively new and acute. Some are, quite frankly, the same as problems experienced in the rest of the world. I think it's quite important when one's thinking about policy reaction to all this to try and dissect these and not to just bundle them all together and say we're all going to hell in a handcart, because it's really much more complex than that. Well, this is a matter of getting the balance right, because to some extent this low productivity in Britain is the flip side of very strong employment. So if you're comparing the UK with France, for instance, you must adjust for this. And I don't think it's a bad thing that we've got so many people in employment, albeit at low wages. But that's, of course, not the end of the story. If it were, then fair enough. But over and above that, I think there's pretty clear evidence that adjusting for all that, productivity in the UK is comparatively low. Why? Well, I suppose the apologists might say it's something to do also with having a large service sector compared to the size of manufacturing. Manufacturing productivity tends to be higher. But I think the fundamental reason is that UK workers, on average, aren't skilled enough, they haven't been trained enough, and over and above that, UK employers have not invested enough in capital equipment in order to make workers more productive. Well, the current account deficit, or if you like, the trade deficit writ large, is not sustainable. To run a deficit of the size that we've been doing recently will eventually go bust, or rather, to put it more accurately, foreigners and the wealth holders will no longer supply you with the finance to keep all that going. No, it's not sustainable, and we should want to stop it and turn the position round well before we get to that point. With regard to having low rates of investment, unfortunately that is sustainable. It is possible to carry on, not desirable, but it is possible to carry on with very low rates of investment. Again, though, you've got to be careful about the data. We're pretty sure that all these big things we don't measure very well, including investment, because as you move more into a service economy, which is what the UK is, and in particular into the sort of services we do with a major role for digital, what exactly is investment? In many cases, it is software, which may not be counted as investment. The old days of investment consisted of building huge factories and plants. Well, to some extent that's still true, but it's an awful lot more complicated than that now. Well, to some extent, I think investment will probably recover naturally as the balance of the economy recovers. If I'm right in thinking that exports will do well as a result of the pound's devaluation, manufacturing will start to rise, I think, a bit as a share of GDP. It's already growing relatively fast compared to the rest of the economy. Then I think you'll tend to find firms investing more than they have been recently. But over and above that, I think we do need government measures to encourage big firms in particular to be investing more. If you say to me, is the UK model bust, and I say to you, well, which bit of it are you particularly thinking about? You direct the question to me, the bit of the Britain's model that I think is bust is corporate governance. Now, we're not alone in that, and it's true of the United States as well. But essentially, we've allowed to develop a system in which companies are largely run for the benefits of their senior executives. The shareholders, who are of course underwrite all this, subscribe to the capital and are the nominal beneficiaries of what goes on, are not good stewards by and large of the long-term interests of those companies. And this model is essentially broken. The result is not just ridiculously high pay for senior executives, though I think that is a scarring feature of our capitalist system here in the UK. The result is the deterrence of long-term investment. Executives have not got the incentives to spend large amounts of money on real investment, which may only have a payoff long into the future, well after they've left. Well, this is a problem that's not just a UK issue. The United States as well is affected by this. There have been umpteen proposals about this, including the Kay Commission, which came up with several. I think you have to focus on the incentives facing large institutional shareholders, penalising short-term holdings of shares, reforming the obligations of long-term shareholders and directors to get them to focus more on the long-term interests of the company and all its stakeholders. That's, I think, the route to go. It's not a matter of directing companies what to do. One wants the benefits still of competition, free enterprise and choice in a free economy. But there's something gone wrong with the way this part of the economy works. Now, of course, it's interesting that classic capitalism as depicted in the textbooks doesn't have this problem, and in practice it didn't have it in the 19th century. Those mythical top-hatted Victorian entrepreneurs were the owners and managers of their business. So they didn't face this issue. And if it wasn't their own interests that they were thinking about, very often it was the interests of their families, their sons and daughters and so on, who would carry on with the benefits of the firm. This is really a problem that's developed over the last 100 years, but it's intensified over the last 30 years or so, with share ownership concentrated in big fund management companies that don't take an active role in managing the business, and executives focus too much on the short-term performance of the share price. There is a fundamental issue here, because in society there are lots of long-term savers and investors who are interested in returns over the long term. Obviously there are short-term speculators as well, but quite a few private investors, that's what they're interested in. They want to invest their money in things that are going to provide a payoff in 20 years' time, I don't know, save for their retirement or to fund school fees for their children or something or other. And yet somehow the financial system does not translate those pressures to the people at the receiving end, that's to say the executives making decisions about investment. That's what I mean when I say the system's broken. It's not that there aren't people in the system wanting the things that I've suggested overall the country needs. There are. It's just that somehow or other those signals aren't fully transmitted. Yeah, I think it is unbalanced both sectorally and regionally. Look, we're not going to go back, nor should we want to go back to the days when manufacturing accounted for 30-35% of GDP. And again, a large part of what we've experienced here in the UK is part of an international phenomenon. People often contrast the UK with Germany, and it's true that their share of manufacturing is probably double, maybe a bit more than double ours. But Germany actually is the outlier. The United States has also enjoyed or suffered, whatever you would use, a substantial fall in the share of manufacturing in the economy. So has France. UK may have gone a bit further than you might have expected, a bit further than other countries, but it's not dramatic. So I think part of the answer to this is yes, at the margin, I think manufacturing should be bigger and stronger. And the reason why I think it's been so squeezed has an awful lot to do with the exchange rate in this country, which has been far too high for too long. And now that it's at, I think, a pretty reasonable level, that should help to rebalance. But this word services is highly misleading. It sort of tends to conjure up people in smocks serving in sort of tea houses somewhere in the Cotswolds. Lots of Britain's services are, of course, tremendously sophisticated and very high value added. And we're not just talking financial services either. Business services, across the whole gamut pretty much, Britain is a leader. And I think we're going to see those sectors do extremely well. I do think that we've become a bit too reliant on financial services. Not that I in any way want to see the city clobbered, very far from it. And I hope and believe it's got a bright future. But I think it has become a bit too dominant in the UK economy. And partly because of that, of course, London's become a bit too dominant. So it would be, I think it would be a better use of resources, should we say, if other parts of the economy started to do relatively well. That would help to regionally rebalance the UK economy and sectorally do so too. Well, it's very difficult to say if the pound's overvalued or not. Frankly, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. I suspect it's not. I suspect it's about right, actually. If we can hold it at this sort of level, then I suspect British exporters will be able to do very well. Because obviously it also depends on the international context. And over the last few years, the UK has been struggling against the fact that its main market in the Eurozone has not been doing very well. Now that's no longer true. The Eurozone is growing quite strongly. And so on this sort of exchange rate, I expect UK exporters to do well. Well, there's certainly a change in the rhetoric and the tone. What that amounts to, well, we'll have to see. I mean, it's quite possible, I think, to have that tone and that rhetoric and to do things to boost overall economic performance, which aren't really that much against the thrust, the ideological thrust of the last 30 years. This is what I would be trying to do. Now, for instance, boosting public investment on infrastructure, being interventionist in markets that don't work, spending public money on research and development and training. All these things involve the state being more interventionist in the economy. But I wouldn't say they were actually against the thrust of economic policy and philosophy over the last 30 years. It's really when the government says, right, I think pharmaceuticals are the key strategic interests of the future, and I'm going to pour a load of money into that particular sector. That's when you, I think, are into a different sort of world. I don't think enough has been done. I think we have made a number of necessary moves. We've made some progress, but in no sense, I think, have we got to the point where we can be sure that a crisis won't happen again. They always have a way of popping up in surprising places. Probably the biggest change, I don't know how long this is going to last, they tend to last a generation, these changes, is actually ideological, in the sense that the policymakers now pretty much think that they can't just leave Will alone. Even Alan Greenspan admits the system didn't work the way he presumed it worked. He thought you could leave the managements of big banks to behave not just rationally, but fully in the interests of their own institutions, and he's essentially recanted on that. So I think what we will find is that the policymakers will be vigilant in relation to risks run by the system. And some people will argue, in regard to what they've done, they've been too vigilant. I mean, there is a view that the reaction of policymakers helped to produce the slowness of the economic recovery because they constrained banks too much, with the result that bank lending was much too weak. And I think there's more than a bit to that critique, quite frankly. This is typically, of course, what authorities do. They shut the stable door after the horse has bolted, having not taken action to stop the last recession before. They take action now to stop the last recession, and in the process, of course, retard the current recovery. I mean, we've got a long way to go. I mean, in Britain, we're seeing moves by the big banks to separate their retail and ordinary commercial banking from the investment banking side. I think that's right, but I don't think it goes far enough. I would like to see many of our bigger banks effectively broken up and the complete separation by institution of investment banking from ordinary commercial banking. But that's with regard to the dangers of financial crash or something like it. But over and above that, a lot of our financial system is, I think, tremendously inefficient. And it's inefficient not because there isn't the appearance of competition, there appears to be lots of different players competing, but it's to do with the lack of transparency, such that in the end, I don't think it is fully competitive and efficient. This includes things like insurance, pensions management, fund management, a whole series of areas. The result is, I think, that a lot of consumers are not getting good value for money. And this is part also of the excessive size of the financial system, with by and large the rewards that people earn in it, I think, are out of proportion to their social contribution. Well, the essence of the case for Brexit is that we can benefit from being able to run our own affairs, both economically and politically. Now, this would not be obvious if our interests were exactly the same as the interests of other members of the European Union, and or if the European Union was run in an economically efficient and effective way. But the answer to both these questions is in the negative. The UK is very different in its makeup from most other EU economies. It does have this huge financial sector. It's much more open to the world. Different from Germany in having smaller manufacturing. It's different from France in having not such a large agricultural sector. All sorts of other differences. It trades disproportionately heavily with countries around the rest of the world compared to other EU members. So we are very, very different from them. Why should we expect them, in trying to set rules for the grouping as a whole, to set them in such a way that's to our advantage? Then over and above that, the ideology of those people running the EU, specifically the Eurozone, is very different from the prevailing ideology, economic and political ideology, in Britain over the last 20 or 30 years. It is protectionist and statist, and it's dominated by an obsession on the part of those running the union with harmonisation and integration. And the result of that is you get some pretty daft things, for which the euro is the daftest of the lot so far. We didn't have to have a common currency. I think the euro has been responsible. It is, I think, the greatest self-imposed economic disaster in the history of mankind. There are others that have occurred for other reasons, but to actually choose this, it's quite extraordinary. It's responsible for the impoverishment of much of southern Europe. Schengen, the passport-free travel zone. Nice idea in theory. In practice, in the world in which we live, it was straightforwardly bonkers. And we are seeing it in practice being abandoned bit by bit. It hasn't been announced as being abandoned, but in practice it has been abandoned by a number of countries, or it's substantially modified. So this is an entity that makes bad economic decisions that aren't in Britain's interest. Now, from that realisation, then comes a whole series of other things, minor things, but they all are subsumed within that overarching point. Tariffs, for instance. Does it make sense to operate the tariff policy that the EU does? I don't think it does. Outside the EU, we can operate our own trade policy, which will involve hopefully very low tariffs, or no tariffs, and trade agreements with countries all around the world. Regulations. The EU is a highly regulated economic system, and some of these regulations are drawn up in the most peculiar way. The overarching theme is always the perceived interests of a narrow group of producers and the undervaluing of the interests of consumers, and the imposition of these regulations across all countries in the Union, which is what has to happen, means even if they're appropriate for some parts of the Union, they're certainly not appropriate for other parts of the Union. So I think it is the ability to run our country in pursuit of our own interests. That's the simplest way of putting it. I think it's largely gone wrong as a result of becoming too mathematical, and that itself is probably in pursuit of trying to turn it into a science. It's a result of 19th century lust after science. Someone referred to it as physics envy. I think that's a pretty good expression. And the result of that has been a denigration of all those economists who said things like, well, institutions really matter. Some problems aren't treatable easily by mathematics. So that not only the subject has changed, but the people involved in the subject have changed. I mean, so many of the great figures of the past wouldn't be allowed into a university economics department now. I guess that doesn't quite apply to Keynes, because Keynes himself was a good mathematician. But interestingly, he didn't use virtually no maths in his work, and yet, of course, it was profound. So you've got this separation between the theoretical economists who are, I don't know, it's equivalent really of chess or doing the crossword. It's got no relevance to anything, whatever, frankly. It's a game, on the one hand. And then you've got the really serious, live, practical problems of economics, which haven't gone away, on the other. And I think those people, by and large, who are good at performing the first sort of economics have got virtually nothing to offer in relation to the second.